Welcome to Legal Studies, and today we're going to be learning about the role of the Victorian Law Reform Commission. We're also going to be learning about an example of the Law Reform Commission in action, and that'll be our next video. So where are we in the study design? Here we are down here. We've just finished learning about how individuals can get involved in law reform through demonstrations and petitions. Now we're starting to look at some of the more formal methods of influencing law reform. And we're starting off with the official Victorian Law Reform Commission. So what are the main things you need to do in this topic? Well, first of all, you need to know what the VLRC does. You're going to need to provide strengths and weaknesses in terms of how effective is it at influencing Parliament. And you're going to need to provide an example project that the VLRC has done. So what is the VLRC? It's essentially Victoria's leading independent law reform body. And its main role is to review, research, and make recommendations to the government about changes to Victoria's laws. It was created in 2001, and it's funded by the Victorian government, but it's totally independent from Parliament. So it's supposed to be able to provide sort of independent and impartial recommendations about what we should change in our laws. Its main roles, as I said, is to provide sort of an investigation into what should be changed, so this inquiry and investigation role. It also monitors law reform, and so by that I mean once it provides its recommendations, it monitors which bits have been implemented by government and which bits haven't, so it keeps an eye on how reform is progressing, and it also plays a role in educating the community about law reform in Victoria. It has two main types of projects that it does. The main type of project it does is a sort of standard law reform investigation. This is an investigation assigned to them by the government. So the way it works most of the time is that the government asks the VLRC to investigate a particular issue. For example, they've been asked recently to investigate how to make juries more inclusive for the deaf and the blind. The other type of project that the VLRC gets up to is called a community law reform project. And this is a project that the VLRC undertakes sort of on its own. The government hasn't asked them to look into this issue. Instead, they undertake these sorts of investigations for relatively minor things that the general public have brought to their attention. So, for example, the VLRC has done an investigation into neighbourhood tree disputes. What do you do when your tree is grown over into someone else's backyard and you've got a problem with it? That's an issue that the community raised with the VLRC, and they looked into it. So what's the process that the VLRC uses? When they're asked to undertake a law reform project, what do? Well, first of all, they are provided what's called a terms of reference from the government, and this is just a document that sets out what they're supposed to investigate. So it really lays out quite clearly what they are allowed to look into and what they're not, and then they begin their initial research and consultation. So they'll look into what the existing law is and what other countries have done in this particular area. They'll then publish an issues paper, which is where they lay out the main issues for people to think about, and they ask for submissions. So they ask people to send in their ideas. They then hold consultations and discussions with people who are relevant to the topic. They ask experts in the area to weigh in as well. Once they've received all that information, they've done their own research, they've received submissions from the public, they've heard from the experts, they then publish a report with recommendations in it for what we should do. This report is presented to the Attorney General, who's a member of the government, and the Attorney General will then table it in Parliament, so officially present it to Parliament and have it read out in Parliament. And then Parliament gets to choose whether or not to implement the recommendations. So the really key point here is that the VLRC can recommend stuff and Parliament can choose to ignore it if it wants to. So that brings us to our strengths and weaknesses, because one of the biggest weaknesses of the VLRC is that, one, it can only investigate an issue if the government asks it to investigate, or otherwise it can only investigate things that it wants to investigate if they're relatively minor. So either the government asks them or they investigate things on their own that are relatively minor. So if the government doesn't want the VLRC to be able to look into something, the government just doesn't ask them about it. And then secondly, there's no obligation on the part of the Parliament to do anything about their recommendations. The government could just completely ignore the VLRC, which is a really major weakness. On the other hand, because the government has asked the VLRC to investigate, they're more likely to pay attention to the recommendations. They're unlikely to have asked for their help unless they wanted to make some sort of change in that area. So that's one of the things that makes the VLRC more likely to be able to influence reform. Another strength of the VLRC is that it can really measure community views because they get public consultation, they get submissions from the public, they consult experts, so they're able to draw on a huge range of information to present really thorough recommendations. And as a result of the fact that they are independent, its recommendations are likely to be pretty comprehensive and unbiased, so that it's likely that Parliament's probably going to pay attention to them because of those strengths of the VLRC. But a corresponding weakness to that is how time-consuming this whole process is. Usually an inquiry takes 12 to 24 months, so this is not a speedy process, and that may be too slow for an area that Parliament urgently needs attention on. Statistics show us that the VLRC is highly influential. Overall, its recommendations are adopted in approximately 70% of cases. So most of the time, most of its recommendations do go through. But big limitation here is that it's limited to Victorian law. It's called the Victorian Law Reform Commission after all, so it's just about the state of Victoria, and it doesn't make recommendations for Commonwealth law. And that is the Victorian Law Reform Commission. See you next time.